So imagine a teacher in a classroom who announces that 2 students will receive a special scholarship that'll pay for the entire college education. The teacher explains that the scholarship is a gift provided by a generous donor. Now the students begin to wonder who's going to receive it. Some assume the scholarship will go to the students with the highest grades. Some assume that it's going to be those that have worked the hardest. Others assume that it'll be income dependent. But the teacher then announces that the donor has already chosen the recipients according to the donor's own plan. Immediately, some students probably begin to whisper, "That is not fair. We worked hard too. We deserved a chance." But the scholarship was never something the students earned. It was always a gift according to the decision of the one who provided it. And that moment right there, that exposes something about how we think. When something good is given to one person and not to another, our instinct is to often ask whether the decision was fair or not. The same kind of question arises in Romans 9. In the previous passage that we went over last week, we saw that God formed the line of promise according to his own purpose. He was deciding where that line, that seed of the children, was going to be in his redemptive plan. And the promise moved from Abraham to Isaac rather than Ishmael. And then it moved from Isaac to Jacob rather than Esau. And you could see that he was trying to explain that to everybody. And in the case of Jacob and Esau, God even declared distinction before the children were even born, and he made sure it wasn't because of works either. So when people hear that, a question naturally arises in the human heart. Is that fair? Now the Apostle Paul, he knows that question is going to arise. So in this verse, he is continuing that argument line that goes all the way back to Romans 9:1, where he's saddened by the rejection of Israel. And then he's talking about that line of promise and that seed. And then here in verse 14, because he's anticipating some pushback, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? In other words, if God forms the people a promise according to his own purpose, does that mean that God is unjust? Next slide. So this is about God's right to show mercy. The question's been raised in verse 14. Is God unfair? And verse 15 gives us that answer. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. And then that leads us to that conclusion in 18. He has mercy on whom he wills. God is not unjust in the way he shows mercy. Now, Paul answers this objection by pointing us to the power of God's mercy. Now, mercy does not come from human effort. It doesn't come from human deserving. You don't deserve it. You don't get to work towards it. Mercy comes from one place and one place only, and that's from God. And when we understand that, we begin to see why the power of God's mercy shows that God is free to give mercy according to his own will, according to his own plan. And this passage today, verses 14 to 18, these verses, it raises a question that many people quietly wrestle with when they first encounter the teaching of God's purpose in directing his redemptive plan. And after hearing that God directed the line of promise through Isaac rather than Ishmael and through Jacob rather than Esau, a natural concern arises. And that arises in the human heart. If God determines how his redemptive plan unfolds, does that mean God is unfair? The passage begins by confronting that question directly. Is there unrighteousness with God? And of course, it also begins by defending the character of God. God is never unjust. Even when his actions challenge our expectations, his character remains perfectly righteous. Now, when you look at the Greek here, the Greek word translated unrighteousness, that refers to injustice, wrongdoing, or moral unfairness. In today's language, the question is asking whether God acts unjustly in the way he carries out his purposes. Next slide. Imagine a circle. Inside that circle is everything that is righteous, everything that is morally right according to God's character. That's the righteousness. And when there's righteousness, there's justice. And justice belongs inside that circle because justice means someone receives exactly what is deserved. That's justice. If a guilty person receives the proper punishment, that is justice. Justice is not harsh or unfair. Justice is simply what is right. Now, outside the circle, in the wrong direction, which is here on the left, that's injustice. Injustice happens when what is right is violated. If a guilty person were declared innocent without any reason, that would be unjust because righteousness would have been ignored. So when the passage asks, is there unrighteousness with God? It is asking whether God ever gives injustice. The question raised in this passage touches one of the deepest instincts in the human heart. When we hear that God directs his redemptive purposes according to his will, many people immediately ask whether that means if God is unfair. And the apostle raises that concern so that he can answer it clearly. When people encounter something about God's actions, they do not immediately understand, because he does have actions that we do not understand sometimes, especially during suffering or unanswered prayers, or maybe circumstances that we just can't explain. It's easy to assume that the problem lies with God rather than with our own limited perspective and understanding, and begin wondering whether God is treating us unfairly or not. Is that fair? Now imagine two employees working in the same company. One employee receives a promotion while the other does not. The employee who is passed over, well, they might immediately assume the decision was unfair. Well, I've been in the position longer. My numbers are better. I was here first. But the decision may have been based on factors the employee does not see or understand. In the corporate world where I was, people were fast-tracked. I was one of them. There's different things that happen that people do not understand why the decisions are made. And sometimes they think they're unfair. Now, in a similar way, people sometimes evaluate God's actions using their own limited understanding of fairness. The passage reminds us that God's decisions are not measured by human assumptions about fairness, but by his perfect righteousness. Next slide. All right, back to the question, right? So is there unrighteousness with God? And the answer comes immediately and forcefully. Certainly not. I like absolutely not, but certainly not. This expression is one of the strongest denials found in the New Testament. The phrase means something like, may it never be. That's what it is. It rejects the accusation completely. And the passage begins by making it clear that nothing about God's actions can be described as unjust. To explain why that accusation is wrong, Paul turns to a moment in Israel's history when God spoke directly to Moses. I will have mercy on whomever I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whomever I will have compassion. Now, these words come from the book of what? From the book of Exodus. They were spoken after Israel committed the serious sin of worshiping the golden calf. Moses goes up, brings down 10 commandments, they're worshiping a calf, and the people broke the covenant almost immediately after receiving it. If anyone deserved judgment, and that's that righteousness there, it was the nation at that moment. But in the middle of that failure, God declared his freedom to show mercy. Understanding the meaning of mercy is important for this passage. And when you look at the Greek word for mercy, it refers to compassion shown towards someone who deserves judgment. It's not something earned. It's not something owed. Mercy is kindness given to those who cannot claim it as a right. because we know that no one is righteous, and we are all unrighteous. Now, this is closely connected to another word, and that's translated as compassion, which refers to deep pity or tender concern towards someone that's in distress. Both of those words emphasize the same truth. If mercy belongs to God rather than to human effort, then human determination or striving cannot control when or to whom God shows mercy. When God shows mercy or compassion, he is acting from his own gracious character. Mercy is like a judge who sees a guilty person standing before the court and chooses to pay the penalty himself instead of demanding the punishment the person deserves. The statement about mercy leads directly to an important conclusion. So then, it is not of him who wills, nor of him who runs, but of God who shows mercy. Now, the sentence removes two possible explanations why God shows mercy that people often assume. First, the showing of God's mercy does not come from him who wills. The expression refers to human desire or determination. No matter how much you desire it, that doesn't determine it. And the passage makes it clear that human willpower, it does not determine God's mercy. And then the second is God's mercy does not come from him who runs. Now, the explanation or this expression refers to effort or striving. In the ancient world, running was often used as a picture of intense effort, like an athlete competing in a race. And the idea that no amount of human striving can determine God's decision is not possible for God on showing mercy. That doesn't determine it. Instead, the passage points to the true source. God who shows mercy. The word shows mercy emphasizes ongoing action. God's mercy ultimately rests on his own will rather than on human determination or human effort or will or striving or running. Imagine someone trying to push a stalled car up a steep hill by themselves. They strain with all their strength, but the car barely moves. Then another person arrives with a powerful truck and a tow chain and offers to pull the car up the hill. The person pushing the car has a decision to make. They must decide whether to keep struggling alone or accept the help that is offered. And then we also see where Paul turns to another moment in Israel's history to illustrate God's power and purpose. Next slide. And this passage points to two moments in Israel's history. One showing God's mercy through Moses, and another showing God's power through the Pharaoh. Together, these events remind us that God's actions throughout history consistently reveal his character and accomplish his purposes. This time, the example comes from the story of Pharaoh during the time of the Exodus. Verse 17, for the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. So even the most powerful ruler in the world could not prevent God's plan. Pharaoh thought he was in control, but the events of the Exodus showed that God actually rules. And the background of this statement, when you look at the background here, it comes from the events that were in Egypt, when God delivered Israel from slavery. Pharaoh repeatedly refused to release the people. And through a series of dramatic events known as plagues, God demonstrated his power over Egypt's rulers and over Egypt's gods. Now, the phrase, I have raised you up, does not mean that Pharaoh was created evil. No. Instead, it means that the Pharaoh's position as a ruler of Egypt became part of the stage upon which God would display his power. The purpose of these events is clearly stated, that my name may be declared in all the earth. So we see the reason and the purpose for why God was doing this. He wanted to make an example out of them. So through Pharaoh's resistance, God displayed his power so clearly that the surrounding nations hear about it and recognize the authority of Israel's God. God's actions in history are never random. He has a plan. And they reveal his power and make his name known among the nations. Next slide. Now, in the Bible, the name of God represents his reputation, it represents his character, and his glory. Through the deliverance of Israel, people across the ancient world heard about the power of Israel's God. Even generations later, other nations still spoke about the events that took place in Egypt. And in this passage, it concludes by bringing these ideas together. Therefore, he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills, he hardens. Again, the focus starts with and begins with mercy. Mercy is something God freely gives according to his will. And when you look at that Greek word for hardens, it means to make firm or stubborn. In the story of Pharaoh, both realities appear. Pharaoh repeatedly hardened his own heart, and God confirmed that stubbornness as judgment. The hardening was not the creation of evil within Pharaoh, but the strengthening of a resistance that Pharaoh himself continued to express. And when you read that passage and that story, you'll see the Pharaoh hardened his heart first, and then God also continued to harden it as well. And it went back and forth a couple times. But if you think about this justice and righteousness, once someone sins, God has the right to be righteous and to give judgment. And when he has that right to give judgment, to discard somebody, he has that right to do it how he pleases. And in this case, with the Pharaoh, he chose to make an example out of him. And the statement here, it emphasizes that God remains sovereign over history. Mercy and judgment both operate under his authority. Now this brings us back to the question of justice and mercy. Next slide. Earlier we pictured righteousness and justice as a circle that represents what is right according to God's character. Justice is inside that circle because justice means someone receives what they deserve. We went through that. But there's another way that something can appear outside that circle. And that is where mercy and grace come in. Mercy means not receiving the punishment we deserve. And then grace means we're receiving kindness that we never deserved. Mercy and grace are not injustice. They do not violate righteousness. Instead, there is what we might call non-justice. And justice, it gives what it's deserved. Mercy withholds the punishment that is deserved. Grace gives kindness that was never deserved. So when God shows mercy, he is not being unjust. Mercy does not violate righteousness. Mercy is compassion given where justice could have fallen. For many readers, this passage feels difficult because it challenges the way people often think about fairness. In human thinking, fairness usually means that everyone receives exactly the same outcome. The Bible presents a very different picture. Think of it this way. If God gave every person only justice, the result would be judgment for all. And I know I don't want judgment. I want mercy. So the wonder of the gospel is that God shows mercy at all. Mercy is not unfairness. Mercy is grace extended where judgment could rightly fall. It's like God's executive privilege of clemency, like a presidential pardon. So this passage therefore highlights the power of God's mercy. The movement of God's promise does not come from ancestry or effort or human determination. It comes from the mercy of God. And that mercy reveals both the righteousness of God and the glory of his name throughout the earth. But we can see here that the response begins by removing a misunderstanding about mercy. Through Pharaoh's resistance, God displayed his power in a way that the surrounding nations could not ignore. This is the most powerful person to the known world back then. And the Exodus became the testimony that the God of Israel rules. And many people assume that if they try hard enough, they improve their lives enough, or prove themselves worthy enough, they can influence how God treats them. The example of Pharaoh, well, it strengthens the argument by showing how God works within history to reveal his power. Even the decisions of a powerful king like the Pharaoh could not prevent the fulfillment of God's plan. And that's where God just displayed his power over rulers and nations and false gods. So that story there, it reveals a struggle that appears in every generation. Pharaoh repeatedly resisted God's commands, like people do today. And they attempt to maintain control over the situation. His resistance illustrates the human desire to remain in control rather than submit to God's authority. And the human heart often resists God's authority because it wants to remain in control. We want to have our own identification. We want to have our own destiny, control our own destiny. That struggle is still common today. Many people want to bless their plans, and he wants God to bless their plans while still maintaining control over their sinful life. Fornication, adultery, addictions, greed for money, homosexuality, putting God second. But they still want God to bless their plans. They may acknowledge God's existence, but they resist his authority. Imagine a driver who refuses to follow the directions of a navigation system because they believe they know a better route. Even when the directions clearly lead toward the destination, the driver continues to ignore them because he knows better. Eventually, the driver becomes lost because they trusted their own judgment instead of the guidance provided to them. In the same way, people sometimes resist God's guidance and authority, believing their own plans will lead to better outcomes. All right, I'm getting distracted. Back to Moses and Pharaoh events here. So the results of those events was not merely the deliverance of Israel. The result was that God's name became known among many nations. When Israel later entered the land of Canaan, people in other nations were already speaking about what had happened in Egypt. We know this from Joshua 2:10. It records that the people of Jericho had heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea when Israel came out of Egypt. So the reputation of God's power had spread far beyond Israel itself, which is exactly what God said would happen. So this explains the conclusion of the passage that I was talking about. Mercy and hardening both appear within God's authority over history. Mercy reveals God's compassion. Hardening reveals God's justice and power. Neither reality makes God unjust. Instead, both reveal the glory of his character. And when these truths are considered together, the reasoning of the passage becomes clear. God is never unjust or unfair in the way he carries out his purposes and plans. Mercy does not come from human desire or human effort. Mercy belongs to God, and he is free to show mercy according to his own will. And at the same time, God's authority over history ensures that his purposes will be accomplished and his name will be known. Sister Kim is another great example of God giving grace and showing mercy. But here, mercy flows from God's character, not from human merit. Next slide. So when God shows mercy, he is not acting unjustly. Mercy is compassion given where justice could have fallen, and it reveals the goodness and freedom of God. The passage calls us to respond by trusting the character of God. When we see that God is righteous in all his ways and free in showing mercy, the proper response is not accusation or pride, but humility, trust, and gratitude toward the God who has shown mercy. So recognize that God's mercy is given according to His will and respond by trusting His character rather than questioning His righteousness. Come before God in prayer with a humble heart, acknowledging that His ways are always righteous. Trust God's character, even when His ways are difficult to understand and even when you don't agree with them. When circumstances in life seem confusing or painful, you're called to trust that God is never unjust. Submit to God's authority over your life. Your resistance cannot overturn God's purposes. And humble yourself under God's authority and trust His plan. When we understand that mercy belongs to God and flows from His character, the natural response should be gratitude and worship. Thank God regularly for His mercy and let that gratitude shape the way you live, speak, and worship. Thankful that He even woke us up today. Because no one stands before God asking for justice. What every one of us truly needs is mercy. God's mercy shows that He is free to extend compassion according to His own plan and according to His own will. It doesn't come from ancestry, effort, achievement. It comes through the gracious character of God. So the invitation of the gospel is to stop striving to earn what cannot be earned and to receive the mercy that God freely gives through Jesus Christ. The power of God's mercy is not that people can earn it, but that God is free to give it according to His righteous will.